Hey there, King of Kings family. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Beyond Sunday Sermons, our deeper examination of Sunday messages here at King of Kings. I'm Dan Hoppin, the director of small groups, and joining me as always is our director of ministry and the only member of the congregation who likes the color burnt orange, Mike White.
It's good to be here. Let me clarify. I love the color burnt orange. I will acknowledge it's not the prettiest color, but it's beautiful to me.
Okay, that's fair. None of the rest of us have to like it, but if it's beautiful to you, then that's great.
And there are more than one of us in the congregation. Anyway, we'll go on.
We're all sinners in the congregation, but Jesus has redeeming love. And also with us today is teaching pastor and author of the Red Letter Living series, Zender. Hey, Zach.
What's up, guys? Mike, I'm partial, and I've grown in my love for the color red. It's a pretty big color in this state, too.
I would say all the teams that I hate have red in them for the most part. Oklahoma, A&M, Nebraska, Ohio State. I mean, USC. There's all some version of red in there. Maybe that's another podcast at some point.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would listen to that.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
Much as these first few minutes wouldn't indicate, our podcast today is not about our favorite and least favorite colors.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But it is, in fact, about Gen Z. We're going to be talking about just this upcoming generation, and it's a fascinating generation that really, I think it's kind of started to get a bad rap, but these people have just some amazing potential that if we can tap into it, and that was kind of the basis of your message, Zach, and the message that you shared a couple months ago about Gen Z. You said that there are a few, like every message that you preach is obviously important to you, but you said there are a few Sundays every year that are like especially important, where God really puts something on your heart, and when you get up in front of the crowd, like you are just that much more passionate. And I think that really came through during that message. What is it about Gen Z that makes you so impassioned?
Yeah, first and foremost, like I've got two Gen Z boys in my home. And so I know in recognizing some of the things that they deal with, and I do feel like we've been unfair to their generation. And so I would say it's been building my whole life, well, as a dad at least, since my boys have. So that's there. I had this unique opportunity last July to lead the National Youth Gathering, which is, if you count up the college students who volunteer for that as well, it's probably 18,000 plus Gen Zers that were in that stadium in Houston. Congratulations, Mike, on your Houston Astros.
You prophesied the Astros from the stage.
I feel like we left so much glory of God those 4 nights at the National Youth Gathering that it just carried over into your baseball victory. But no, seeing 18,000 strong and their faith, that was a turning point for me. And just a couple things that happened over the course of the year that like really stirred my heart for how this generation is misunderstood. And I think the key, like after preaching, and what really stood out to me, if I could sum it all up in one sentence, was my heart was just reaching out and pleading with Gen Zers of like, it's got to be hard to be you. It's just really hard. And I don't think we recognize and give them that like they're dealing with things that I'm a millennial, an older millennial, that you and I didn't deal with. And like my heart was just like, gosh, it's got to be hard to be 14, 16, 18 years old right now and deal with the stuff that they're dealing with. Because we all dealt with stuff, but it's different, and it feels at another level to me.
Yeah, and just for the clarity, for the purposes of this conversation, we're defining Gen Z as individuals born between 1997 and 2012. I think you bring up a really good point there, Zach, that this generation, I mean, every generation goes through stuff, but this generation, I mean, they've grown up with technology and smartphones, like we talked about in our last episode of Beyond Sunday Sermons, that has some real addictive properties. They just went through COVID in like their formative school years. They were either at home or barely seeing their friends, or everybody's in masks. Like, these are their formative years, and they're not getting to make friendships. They have had massive school shootings, at least one, if not several, every year of their lives. They've basically been alive for the entirety of America's war on terror since 2001. Like, there's a lot that these guys have gone through. How do you think these tragedies have kind of shaped and affected Generation Z?
It has to. So again, not being one generation higher. So I feel like I'm sort of in this middle position right now of life. And that's probably another reason why it's passionate to me is I feel for the first time in the last like year, I've started to like think about my age, like, because I'm at the middle point of my life. I'm 39 and a half, if you still count birthdays, half birthdays. And so like I've got this unique perspective that I can value and understand the older generation and the younger generation and hopefully bring some truth into the middle of it all. And so being my age, Mike, you might remember this too. The very first school shooting that I remember was Columbine in Colorado, and I forget what year that was.
97, I think.
97.
Yep.
So that I was 14 at that point. And that rocked me, man. And that was so not normal. It was so different. And they've had at least one of those every single year that they've lived. And so like just the magnitude, the magnification, the multiplication of that one event, like they deal with that every year, multiple times typically. And so I think that's, again, just stuff that we're maybe forgetting or not aware of that like we didn't have to deal with in the same level. And what my heart was hopefully is like, I just want us to be overall like more empathetic to like and present in their lives to figure out like if they're lonely, if they're anxious like never before, which all the statistics show, if they're struggling with gender confusion, if they're struggling with how to use their smartphones and technology in this world, like let's not just demonize them and think that they're to hell in a handbasket with this generation. Let's empathize and try to figure out why are they the way they are. And by the way, let's also recognize our role in this, that it's partly due to how decisions that we've made and apathy in our own faith that has led to, I think, a lot of the chaos and the sin and the struggle that they're dealing with. And so I don't want people to just think Gen Z's messed up and, you know, they're totally screwed up and there's nothing we can do about it. I want us to see we've played a role in this and let's be empathetic and let's figure this out together, because there's actually some beautiful things about Gen Z as well that when you look into it, there's some good things there that we want to bring out.
And you've done a lot of research into this, Zach. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions about this generation?
I think, and this was another turning point in my journey sort of in 2022 of like, there were 3 or 4 like key pieces. One of them is like, this generation wants you to fight for them. That's not the public opinion, but that is. And I get it as a parent of 2 Gen Zers, like, it's sometimes hard to connect, and the body language that a lot of them kind of have in the forefront, it feels like there's a wall there, and it maybe doesn't feel like they do want us in. But statistics show that as long as there's trust there, they're actually more open to like mentoring and accountability than any generation prior. And the study that showed this in droves for me was Church of the Highlands in Birmingham, Alabama, which is this massive mega church, probably 30,000 people. And so they surveyed their middle and high school students, and it was just one question or statement with a fill in the blank. I wish my parents knew, fill in the blank. And the things that the students said to that survey, to that one statement, like really opened my eyes. You want me to read a few of them?
Go for it. Yes,
So, yeah,
absolutely.
I wish my parents knew. And again, this is all on the backdrop of they don't want us to fight for them. They're standoffish. They don't want us in our lives. So this is what they're actually saying. I wish my parents knew, even though my actions don't always show it, I desperately want to please them. I wish my parents knew how much I love you, even though I don't always say it. How about this? How much I treasured their advice, even when I acted like I couldn't care less. When I saw them fight all the time, it really messed me up. This is a big one. I wish my parents knew their words impact me more than any others. Things they don't remember saying have changed my life. I wish my parents knew the evils I face every day. I wish my parents knew how hard it is to stay pure. Like, these statements wrecked me, man, when I heard this. And these are, again, not from a 42% of students. These are from real lives of high school and middle school students that, in a chance to be honest and reflective of what they wanted their parents, or let's say the older generation, to know, like, that's the stuff that came out. And that wrecked me, because that's not what you hear in public opinion.
Mike, you're a parent of 2 Gen Z kids. What's going through your mind as we start this discussion and you're hearing these things that Zach's talking about?
Yeah. So our kids are the same ages, and I worked with students for 20-ish years, and I think it just shifts. I think the basic needs are still there. Maybe what they're facing looks a little different, and how they display certain things, but they're still made in the image of God. They're still children of God. They desire relationships. They desire to be known, to be encouraged, to be loved, to trust. It's like all these basic things that we as adults need and are kind of aware of. They still need too. You know what I mean? But I think you might see a different exterior and you're not sure what to do with it, but they still have the same longings we do.
Mm-hmm. Zach, you shared in your message that this is a generation that is going to church and being involved in religion less than prior generations. What are the dangers of potentially losing this generation? Like, what's at risk if we continue to not embrace them in the way that Jesus would?
To me, this is like the pinnacle, pivotal piece. I mean, at the end of the day, we're here to honor and glorify God, and to do our best to bring His kingdom into this world. And the more we're around the good news of Jesus, the more we see that opportunity in our life and exposed to those. And so, to me, it's highly dangerous. That's one of the things that's difficult, is they are the quote, least religious generation America's ever seen. And so I would say a couple things. Number one, they shouldn't necessarily be the ones to blame, because a lot of this was millennials that didn't choose the disciplines that a follower of Jesus would choose. And I would say also, like, let's not just blame millennials. Like, it's also this really confusing, conflicted message that's come from, I would say, boomers and Gen Xers, of their actions have shown more chasing after the American dream than the gospel of Jesus. And so you just see this trickle down effect. And it's now the charts are really, and COVID was an accelerator, right? That's what COVID was for a lot of trends that were already happening. It accelerated. And so you see COVID just decimate and take away one of the best religious practices or spiritual disciplines, which is coming and attending church. And it was already bad, and now it's worse. And like, what's at stake is lives, kingdom. When we don't reflect who Jesus is, and when our kids aren't around the message of Jesus, it doesn't pair well for what's going to happen in the future. Yesterday, I was listening to a podcast, and there's a guy in the magazine newspaper industry, and I think all of us can sit here and say that'd be a pretty bad industry to be in if you look at the charts. And I'm trying to do some comparative, because I think the charts for what church attendance looks like mirrors what happens in the newspapers and magazines. And all of us can probably sit here and say, if we saw that chart, we'd recognize there's a major problem. And so I'm saying there is a major problem, because our charts look way more similar to that than they do anything else. And we have to figure out and be intentional and choose the right actions to reverse this trend and do the best we can. And that may all sound like bad news, and there is a lot of bad news in it. But let's remember, we have the God of the universe on our side, inside of us. And so, like, I can look at charts and trends, and they can depress me and sadden me. But at the end of the day, our God transforms charts and trends all day long. And so I'm not coming thinking everything is hopeless, but I am saying this should feel heavy and really important and we ought to do everything we can for this because it matters.
It's fascinating. A couple of years ago, Julie Easley, our executive director, and I had lunch with a couple other executive directors from the city, from Christ Community, from LifeGate. We were kind of talking about these trends and declines in attendance. And the guy at Christ Community, they dug into the database and they found that now they have more unique people attending than they did 10 or 20 years ago, even though attendance has gone down 30%, let's say, whatever the number is. But people are just attending less frequently. So that's part of it. So you see the overall numbers, but actually right now we're seeing more unique people coming. And Dan, your question's interesting. I think I maybe want to reframe that a little bit. We say that the church losing Gen Z. So is this a church issue? And I'd say, well, who's the church? Well, it's people. Well, it's parents. So I hope our heartbeat here is that we're family-centered, church-supported. So if it's all the church's job to target and hunt down Gen Z, like that's not how the church is designed. The church is people and individual family units. And in some ways, society's shifted. And I think parents have given up the role. Like Zach had said, they'd made different choices. And so they're attending less, or it's less of a priority, or we're just going to travel every weekend, or let select sports consume
sports.
our lives, right? And so then you wonder why they're attending less. Well, because their parents attended less than their parents, and they might have had bad experiences or whatever, but there's this trickle down now, and you're seeing it much more pronounced in Gen Z. So I think we've got to reframe the question and say, parents, you're the primary stewards of your kids' faith lives. And we as a church want to support, equip, rally the church together and worship and celebrate communion and baptism and everything else. But man, it's primarily a parent thing.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I kind of meant society in general. Like Gen Z attendance at church is going down. How do we respond to that? I didn't mean necessarily that the church is doing anything that's alienating Gen Z, although I'm sure that there are things there as well. And I think that kind of plays into my next question is just, how do we start to reverse this trend? What does it look like to steward and to fight for Gen Z?
Yeah, it's good. So we know that there's a problem, and part of fighting against that is building a plan, and I think getting everyone involved. And so to Mike's point, I do think it's very heavily parents, but it's also everybody. And so I don't want to just, if you're not a parent, you have no role in this. No, I think everybody has a role, and Gen Z has a role. They need to be a part of this as well. And so how do we fight it? How do we reverse the trends? Let's build a plan and let's educate everybody on what the plan is, and let's everybody take a step. And so in the sermon that I gave 4 things, and I can expand on any of them, but being positive towards this generation instead of tearing down and knocking down like Americans have always done with the next generation. So how do we be positive? This is a spiritual issue, and so prayer is for sure at the forefront of all of this. And I've said before that sometimes the most important or impactful, meaningful things that we do on this earth won't be things that we do, but prayers that we've prayed. Because at the end of the day, it's, again, about God, not us. We have a role, but let's put it in his powerful hands. So prayer is another one. I do think prioritizing church, it's a discipline that is really important. And so to Mike's point, we may be reaching more unique users through our weekend expression, and especially through all the online content that we provide, which is really great. I am all for that, and I celebrate that. But habits and rhythms that are more reproducible, more consistent, and that's where I do think if you are a parent, you do have a role, and you ought to prioritize church over kids' sports and other idols that pop up, entertainment. The weekend shouldn't be built around just entertain. I'm not saying you can't do that. Have fun, enjoy. That's God put us here to enjoy this creation. Enjoy kids' sports. I love them, but never should anything take the role of God. And so we need to prioritize church. And then finally, the 4th one I put was provide opportunities. This is some of the good things about Gen Z is this generation more than any other wants to be producers, not just consumers. And so how do we provide opportunities and stop telling them all the things that they can't do. I'm not saying we never tell them what they can't do, right? But it's not thou shalt not, but let's invite them into opportunities that will elevate the good out of them and not be so negative. And so those are 4. If I were to re-preach it, I would add a 5th or maybe take one out and figure it out. But it also still has alliteration, Mike, which is good for you. And it's just be present, being present. I think that's the one that hopefully all of these hit at. But being present is such a huge piece in this battle plan. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you see shifts and trends in time. And I would say in general, parents are more present now than 50 years ago. So like you see good and bad with different generations. And so I think parents are more present. I was thinking from a student ministry lens. So I think the average attendee is like 1.5 Sundays a month is kind of the general, something like that. That's a trend number I've heard of how often you attend. And so I probably for me growing up in church, it was this duty thing that you just go to church every Sunday. You don't think about it, whether it's good or not, you just show up. And I think that's kind of waned over time, that responsibility. And from a student ministry lens, this is to what Zach was saying, relationships have always been important, but they're much more important now, I think, for why kids want to come to church. Well, if you're coming once a month, it's really hard to build a relationship with somebody. And so numerous parents, and they'll say, well, so-and-so doesn't have any friends here. And I'm like, well, because you come once a month or once every 2 months. Like it's really hard to develop relationships. So it's like the chicken and the egg, which one comes first? But man, when you're invested, when you're engaged, you develop relationships, your skills are being used. I thought about our production team. Our production team has 6 or so teens that are in high roles, like directing services at a mega church, and they're killing it. Like that's how many interns have we had that are 16, 17, 18, 19 that are just doing incredible work. So speaking to your point, Zach, I love seeing them use their gifts, skills, and abilities.
The developing relationship parts is interesting and intriguing as well, Mike, because don't you think that it's harder today for someone to develop a relationship with all of the social, technological, COVID happened? So, a lot of times you'll hear from us older millennials, like these kids are just socially awkward. More socially awkward than they once were. And it's hard to develop relationships when you're socially, when you're on screens or with technology as much as they are. When in my generation, and again, I'm not trying to knock, these are differences. It's just different. We were outside playing in the yard and, meeting with kids and throwing ball around and doing whatever we could in the neighborhood. And that's not there anymore. Right.
That's a trend I've noticed, is that they're less functional socially. And I think stats bear that out as well. And you see the iPhone, I think it was in 07 came out. And those are trends where, and I think you referenced some in your message, where in some ways you're seeing positive. They're drinking less and later. They're smoking less and later. They're having sex less and later, but they're dating less and later. They're driving less and later, right? It's all these things are moving away. It's because there's a lot more isolation and screen and home base. So it does make it harder to build relationships. You're fighting against these things. So in some ways you're seeing moral trends in a positive way, but I don't know if the root of it's really positive.
I hear you.
Yeah.
But and my point is, if it was hard for us to develop a relationship 25 years ago, showing up once a month, add on top of that all of the complexity today with not just the screens, but gender confusion and everything else that they're living in, it's just really hard to develop good relationships without time.
Right. And I was going to say mental health is a big factor, and every generation's got positives and negatives. And in a lot of ways, there's been a light that's been shown upon mental illness, and it's more in the forefront. So we're seeing and we're helping kids in these ways. So it's really good that we're dealing with this, but it's also contributed to a higher level of anxiety, depression, isolation, which then spirals upon itself. And so you're seeing it. It's a challenging area. I know my heart breaks for this generation, and you see less and less relationships and deepening, and man, the church should be the primary place for that.
I think these last couple minutes really play into the heart of what it looks like to steward and to empower the next generation. You can't do that without understanding them, without knowing where they come from, without knowing what they're going through. So Zach, I know that you shared, a lot of different characteristics in your message. You guys obviously both have Gen Z kids. You see them, you see their friends. Mike, you've worked in students. Just what are some other characteristics or things that you see about this generation that it's like, in order to reach them, we should know this about them?
Yeah, and really, I talked about the battle plan. Here's some things we do. My one hope with this podcast, and even with the message, is that someone's heart that maybe is from a different generation would change from a negative perception of a Gen Zer to just be a learner and empathetic of what Gen Z is going through. And likewise, I hope if there's a Gen Z person listening, that they would do the same for other generations, that they would understand and listen. And so that would be the key piece in this for me, is I'm asking for heart change. I'm asking, instead of being negative, for empathy and for understanding. And to your point, Dan, when empathy and understanding get there, you start to understand and see why they're the most racially and ethnically diverse generations. And that's building and that's growing. And that's, while it ought to be celebrated in many ways, it's also confusing. And again, the gender confusion that they're going through right now, these are things that we didn't deal with at our age, in our teenage years. These are, again, some of the most formative years is what we're talking about. At our age now, where we're 30, hopefully we have some more understanding and some maturity that's there. They're learning about these things and going through these things kind of as it plays out, and trying to have to figure out what to do with all of that. And so, you see those. One of the, I think, stats I shared, I hope I remember it right, is that a Gen Zer today has the anxiety levels of what we would put into a psychiatric ward in the 1950s. That's what's going on inside of them. And that if they're connecting with a Gen Zer, I would hope they realize it's really hard and difficult and confusing to grow up in the world that they live in. If they thought that, rather than Gen Z to hell in a handbasket, they're worthless, then we've done a really good change, a really good heart change.
Yeah, I think you grow in compassion when you have proximity.
Yeah.
I know, just working with students for years, like, you hear someone's story and they might be behaving weird or be tough to deal with, but like, when you hear their story, you have compassion. So I think that's what you're asking, is inviting people to understand and hear their story and compassion. I think a few changes I've seen, and we all have with the advent of smartphones, is access to information. Like, there's just a bombardment of information constantly, and typically it's negative. You talked about mass shootings. I don't have the exact stats in front of me, but I think over the last 4 years, it's like 1 every 10 or 11 days there's a mass shooting. Right? So I mean, what does that do when you're walking into schools where mass shootings happen frequently? They're kind of on the edge. I think what I've noticed is more of a fishbowl and like a ramping up of pressures on kids, because they're seeing photoshopped images of everyone around them who are perfect and they don't measure up. And then I remember going home from school on a Friday, and then you have your buddies in the block or whomever you played with, but then you're not aware of everyone else in your whole school. Well, now Gen Z is aware of what everyone's doing on the weekend. There are certain apps where they see maps of their friends are doing something together and they're not invited. And so you just kind of wonder, but this is like always in front of them in a positive light. And this is a whole other topic, but I think this generation is much more inclusive across the board. Mm-hmm. So like, these are positive shifts. You're like, wow, they're actually really inclusive of a variety of lifestyles and disabilities and functions and all those sorts of things. So that's a cool thing. So there's some good things, and you're seeing some bad things, but just like Zach said, really just being aware of our own kids, or if you don't have kids, like what this generation is going through.
Mm-hmm. Zach, you mentioned like this is a very entrepreneurial generation. This is a generation that doesn't just want to be a consumer, but they want to be a contributor if you engage with them. And you had a line in your message. You said, "Don't suppress the evil, but elevate the good." What does that look like? How can we do that with Generation Z?
Yeah, the study I referenced, I forget where it's from, but 72% of high schoolers want to be entrepreneurs. That's crazy.
That's incredible.
And by the way, hopefully that doesn't happen because we need people to,
Yeah.
you know, I love all what that shows me is like we've got really creative, and that's what's being built up, I think, through a lot of the technology and everything else, is it's allowing people to be really creative in using their God-given gifts. And so if they're already thinking about this, like let's again, rather than suppressing that, let's bring that out in them. And so how can we get them thinking about doing good things, right? Providing opportunities for them, providing them opportunities to go on mission trips and to see what other cultures are going through. Because again, like as Mike said, they're inclusive. And so the more they learn, the better about this. What if, rather than thinking about dating, we can get them thinking about smuggling Bibles into another country? Or rather than trying to limit their screen time, we get them thinking about how to build an app that fights against human sex trafficking. What if rather than telling them don't drink, go build wells where people can actually drink the real physical water that they need? And so ideas like this of like, how do we empower students and those in the Gen Z that we want you to do this? Like it's good. And that's a thing that we see again is they're producers. They show a level of care that their actions on the ground want to match. And I think that's rare and a really awesome ability that's growing up in them, this creative side that then says, I don't just want to talk about it, I want to do it. And if there's something that our generation and previous maybe known for is we talk a lot, but show me what it looks like. Show me what it looks like to be a disciple. Show me what it looks like to follow Jesus. Show me why it makes a difference. And these students, they do this if they're invited into these opportunities. And so we who have some more years on us, how can we open our hands earlier to this generation rather than later? And so it's like, I don't need them to grow up to be 35 years old and to have the experiences of the last 15, 20 years before they do something. No, if they're 18 and got a great idea and God's given them the passion, pour into them and provide the opportunity and the platform and the space to make it happen and see what happens and grow with them and talk with them and coach them and be accountable to them. And by the way, you'll learn some things along the way too.
I was thinking about the 72%. That's a fascinating stat.
Yeah.
You wonder what caused that. A thought I had was the whole culture of being an influencer.
Yep.
Where you see this trend online of these millionaires who are just getting paid tons of money for doing certain things. I don't know. That's a speculation.
Sure.
It probably contributes to it somewhat. But to your point, how does the church help younger people steward their gifts, to understand their gifts, their passions, and then steward them well? We've talked nowhere in scripture does it say at a certain age you become relevant in the church. Like if you think of the disciples, most of those guys were teenagers.
Yep.
And had a bad background. They weren't these stellar students. They'd probably failed out of religious school, but here's who Jesus picked was the B team, And so everyone's got gifts. How do you raise them up, grow them up, use them? Like I said, our production team, I love seeing the young guys there. In student ministry, how do you raise up leaders and say, man, you're gifted in this. You could serve, you could play in the worship team, like church-wide, and you're not limited to student ministry. Like get our students on the main stage, get our students here and there. So as church leaders, we should be raising up, equipping, and empowering these kids to use their gifts.
As we wind the podcast down here, I just want to give you guys an opportunity, especially you, Zach, because I know that this is a topic that is just so prevalent in your mind and on your heart. I think we've given a lot of great wisdom and a lot of great understanding on this podcast, but is there anything that you would want to leave anyone listening to this with as they, start thinking about how can I steward, how can I impact Gen Z?
Yeah, I want each person to get in the game. And so the verse that I shared, I'd love to read that. It was from Nehemiah, who, chapter 4, verse 14. He said, after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. There's so much about that verse that I love. Don't be afraid of them, even if they feel standoffish and their body language shows you deeper down, they want you to fight for them. And then I love Nehemiah. He puts it, remember the Lord who is great and awesome. So again, we may be facing an uphill battle from world trends and charts in our natural eyes, but we have the God who is great and awesome on our side. So we remember that. We put it in his hands. But then Nehemiah says, but we're going to fight. We're going to fight for our families, for our sons and daughters. And so my plea would be, get in the game, fight with us, help me fight better, and let's all fight together, because I know God's going to prevail.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I was writing down 1 Corinthians 12 where it talks about the body of Christ. Like if everyone plays their part and does their role and parents step in and we serve in student ministry and whatever else, like you're not going to see a lost generation, quote, because everyone's doing their part. So I just echo what Zach's saying. Play your part, be on board and on point for the body of Christ.
This is great wisdom. Thank you so much, guys, for sharing these unique insights. And yeah, let's just, everybody listening to this, let's make an impact. Let's not push Gen Z away, or like you said, Zach, just say, oh, forget those guys. They're standoffish. Let's really try and embrace them and bring them into the church. And even if it's not just church, just interact with them and be there for them. Be present, as you said. I think that's maybe the most important takeaway from today. Anyway, thank you, listeners, as always, for checking out this episode of Beyond Sunday Sermons. Thank you to Mike and Zach for joining me today. And let's, as always, live our faith lives beyond Sunday.